When we talk about prosperity in Canada, increasingly, we're talking about Canadian energy. And we have to come to terms with that fact across this entire country. We've had a lot of rhetoric over the past 2 years on energy, a lot of rhetoric, but very little dialogue. And one thing that we have to remember is that for better or for worse, Canadian energy is the cornerstone of Canadian prosperity. That is the hand we've been dealt. And our job as Canadians is to figure out the best way to play that hand. And make no mistake, don't begrudge it. It is a beautiful hand to have. On the first deal, we were given a royal flush. And we have to figure out how we move forward with that. So for us to begrudge it and say, oh, I wish we didn't have to deal with the oil sands, is foolish. That is what is driving our economy at the moment, and together as Canadians, we figure out the best way to do it. I'm going to suggest to all of you today that what we need is what President Obama calls an all-of-the-above energy strategy. Canadian energy has to have access. Canadian energy has to have access to the West Coast, the East Coast, and the Gulf Coast. Canadian energy has to be accessible to Canadian consumers. Of course, Canadian energy has to include alternative sources, and of course, those alternative sources of energy should become a larger proportion of Canadian energy. But for now, the lion's share will come from the Canadian oil sands. And my thoughts on the Canadian oil sands are pretty straightforward. I'm a policy wonk, after all. I'm a former academic. And I'll tell you this straightforwardly, which is we have a resource that's worth a lot in this nation. It's worth a lot to all of us as citizens. It's worth a lot to governments. We all know that someday, it might be our grandkids, it might be our grandkids, but we all know that someday that resource will be worth less. We know that there will be a lower carbon world. So I ask you then, from a public policy perspective, does it not make sense to monetize the asset when the asset is valuable? Of course, managing the environmental impacts as best as you possibly can, but creating from that resource of declining value, something that our kids and grandkids can rely upon. Now that means governments have to be responsible. It means we got to save the money. My government hasn't been that good about that in Alberta. You can't burn the furniture to heat the house. But thinking about the right way to do this in a way that ensures a legacy for our kids and grandkids is incredibly important. And to take a 1 meter wide pipe and to make that 1 meter wide pipe bear all the sins of the carbon economy is counterproductive, foolish, and destroys prosperity for future generations. We have to figure out the way to make this happen, and it cannot be by demonizing Canadian energy through the Alberta oil sands.